Let me tell you the one thing 50 Cent will never admit on camera, and it is the reason this entire feud has lasted 17 years without a truce, without a peace summit, without a single quiet week. Rick Ross is not the villain in 50 Cent's story. Rick Ross is the mirror. And every time Rick Ross laughs, buys a mansion, cuts a lawn, boards a plane, or breathes on a podcast, 50 Cent has to look at mirror and see the one man in hip-hop who refused to be broken by 50 Cent. That is what this new financial rumor storm is about. Nobody is telling you that part. I am. Buckle nothing. Just listen, because the layers underneath the story are wilder than anything you have seen on the timeline this week. Look at what actually happened. A single blurry airport photo drops online. Rick Ross is standing in a boarding line like a regular passenger. No jet, no entourage. Just Rick Ross, a duffel bag, and a Tuesday. Within 6 hours, the internet decides Rick Ross is broke. Within 12 hours, the memes go global. Within 24 hours, 50 Cent is dancing on Instagram Live with a caption about Starlink and a 2-bedroom apartment. And within 48 hours, the entire hip-hop internet is convinced Rick Ross is one missed royalty check away from foreclosure. All of that from one photograph. One photograph that could have been taken for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with money. Yet the story spread like it was carved into stone. That is the first thing nobody is admitting. Perception in 2026 does not need proof. Perception only needs a caption and a repost. And 50 Cent understands that engine better than any rapper alive on this planet right now. But here is the twist the timeline is missing. Rick Ross did not panic. Rick Ross did not delete. Rick Ross did not go on a defensive apology tour. Rick Ross went on a podcast, calmly, and dropped a line that should have ended the whole conversation, and instead lit a bigger fire. Rick Ross said, and this is a direct quote, that when 50 Cent sued Rick Ross years ago, Rick Ross had a lawyer pull up 50 Cent's finances in open court and discovered 50 Cent was living in a 2-bedroom apartment. Rick Ross said Rick Ross felt bad for 50 Cent. Rick Ross said the number was so small the judge sealed it. Rick Ross said, and this part is a money quote, that Rick Ross knew people who bought 2-bedroom condos just with their puppies. That was the punchline. Puppies. Rick Ross compared 50 Cent's living situation to a dog kennel and smiled while saying it. Now stop and think about what that line does psychologically. 50 Cent has spent 17 years painting Rick Ross as a fake correctional officer with a made-up name. Rick Ross responded once, calmly, with a courtroom receipt. Not a diss track, not a subliminal, a receipt. That is the difference between these two men. And it is the reason 50 Cent cannot let this feud die quietly. Because if the world ever fully believes Rick Ross over 50 Cent, the whole 50 Cent brand cracks. The brand is built on being the untouchable financial genius of hip-hop. The brand is built on the Vitamin Water story, the G-Unit empire, the Power television universe, the Diddy documentary, the boxing promotions, the champagne line, the headphones, the film studio in Shreveport. That brand cannot survive a public perception that 50 Cent, at any point in the 50 Cent career, was living smaller than the man 50 Cent has been mocking for a decade. So every time Rick Ross trends, 50 Cent has to move. Not sometimes. Every time. And that pattern, that reflex, is the tell. Watch it once and you cannot unsee it. Now let's talk about the airport photo itself, because there's a detail nobody has zoomed in on. Rick Ross was flying commercial to Colombia, not to a business meeting, not to a court date, to party with Trick Daddy. That is the context Rick Ross gave, on record, on camera, in a room full of witnesses. Rick Ross said the private jet was being upgraded with Starlink connectivity, a system that cost roughly $500,000 to install, and Rick Ross chose to fly commercial for a weekend trip with a friend. That is not a broke man story. That is a man who owns a jet expensive enough to justify a 6-figure Wi-Fi upgrade, sitting in coach because a friend wanted to hang out. And the internet turned it into a bankruptcy rumor. Here is what the internet did not check. The FAA registry for private aircraft, the Wingstop franchise numbers, the Luke Belair distribution deal, the Rap Snacks equity share, the Checkers ownership stake, the publishing catalog, the Maybach Music Masters. Rick Ross owns pieces of businesses that print money whether Rick Ross tours or not. Rick Ross owns pieces of businesses that print money whether Rick Ross wakes up in a good mood or not. Rick Ross once told Complex, in an interview that is still on YouTube, that a single Wingstop location in Cutler Ridge became a $1 million per year store within 18 months of opening. Rick Ross owns dozens of those. Dozens. Not one. Dozens. Do the math the timeline refuses to do. Now flip the coin. What has 50 Cent actually released and personally owned in the last 36 months? A Diddy documentary that 50 Cent did not own the underlying archive on. A power spinoff that stars, produced, and controls. Boxing cards under someone else's promotional banner. That is the truth Rick Ross dropped like a piano on the podcast. Rick Ross said, and Rick Ross said it slowly, that 50 Cent get to check on those projects, but 50 Cent does not own the masters. 50 Cent does not own the syndication rights. 50 Cent is a name on a poster and a bag on a signing day. Rick Ross said Eminem saved 50 Cent. Rick Ross said Dr. Dre saved 50 Cent. Rick Ross said 50 Cent came in through shady aftermath, and Rick Ross came in through slip and slide and built the empire alone. Whether or not you agree with Rick Ross, the framing is devastating because the framing is not about talent. The framing is about ownership, and ownership is a language 50 Cent has spent a career weaponizing against everyone else. So when 50 Cent posts a joke about Rick Ross cutting a lawn, understand what is actually happening. 50 Cent is not clowning Rick Ross. 50 Cent is reminding the audience to keep looking at Rick Ross, because if the audience looks too long at 50 Cent's own portfolio, the story changes. That is the hidden mechanic of this beef. 50 Cent does not attack from strength. 50 Cent attacks from redirection. Redirection is the whole playbook. Redirection is why the lawn joke exists. Redirection is why the jet joke exists. Redirection is why nobody talks about 50 Cent's own portfolio anymore. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because Rick Ross said something on that podcast that most fans skip right over, and it is the most important sentence of the entire cycle. Rick Ross said Rick Ross would sit down with 50 Cent at Star Island and give 50 Cent a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to pitch the film studio ideas Rick Ross had heard 50 Cent was building in Shreveport. Rick Ross said the past does not matter to men of business. Rick Ross said Rick Ross saw the renderings. Rick Ross saw the drawings. Rick Ross said come to the table. That was not a diss. That was an offer. In hip-hop feud language, that was a chess move nobody expected, and 50 Cent responded within hours by mocking the invitation on Instagram Live. 50 Cent did not accept. 50 Cent did not counter. 50 Cent doubled down on the lawn jokes. Why? Because accepting the meeting would mean admitting the war is optional. And the war is not optional for 50 Cent. The war is the content. The war is the algorithm. The war is the reason people still click on 50 Cent's page in 2026. Take the war away and what is left? That is the question nobody in 50 Cent's camp wants to ask out loud. Let us go deeper. The watch debate. Some collectors online started zooming in on a piece Rick Ross wore in a recent post and questioning whether the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak on Rick Ross's wrist was authentic. Not one of those collectors provided serial numbers. Not one of those collectors provided authentication paperwork. Not one of those collectors provided a jeweler statement. Yet the theory spread. Because in the current internet climate, a theory does not need evidence. A theory only needs a screenshot and a caption that says look closer. And once you tell people to look closer, people will find whatever they were told to find. That is not journalism. That is a hallucination with a comment section attached to it. And Rick Ross has not said one word back about the watch. Not one. Because responding validates the theory. The concert attendance rumors work the same way. Somebody attends one show that looks half full and posts a photo from a bad angle at the wrong time of night. The photo goes viral. Nobody mentions the opening act ran long. Nobody mentions a venue is a shed with sightlines that hide the balcony. Nobody mentions a tour just crossed into a smaller market. The photo becomes a story. The story becomes the truth. The truth becomes a meme. The meme becomes a bankruptcy rumor. That is the pipeline. That is how it works every time. And Rick Ross is not the first artist to get chewed by that pipeline. Rick Ross is just the loudest brand currently in its jaws. Now, let us pull in the character nobody is naming in the main headlines. Uncle Murder. Uncle Murder is the one who reposted the airport photo, first with a caption designed to embarrass Rick Ross. Uncle Murder is a Brooklyn commentator who has been doing what Uncle Murder does for years, which is throw stones at legends from a smaller pond. Rick Ross fired back with a line, so cold it deserves its own paragraph. Rick Ross offered Uncle Murder and Uncle Murder's kids a free dental cleaning. That was the response. Free teeth cleaning. Rick Ross did not diss Uncle Murder's music, because Uncle Murder does not have hit music to diss. Rick Ross went straight for a hygiene joke, which is the hip-hop equivalent of telling somebody they smell. And then Rick Ross said something even sharper. Rick Ross said Uncle Murder never killed anything, meaning Uncle Murder never had a hit record, never had a hit business, never had a hit anything. In one sentence, Rick Ross humiliated the man 50 Cent was using as a proxy. That is not a broke man's energy. That is a man who has time, patience, and a stockpile of one-liners waiting. Here is the piece the timeline has completely forgotten. Rick Ross has a property most rappers only fantasize about. Rick Ross owns Promised Land, the estate in Fayetteville, Georgia that Rick Ross bought from Evander Holyfield for a fraction of its listed value. Rick Ross rides a tractor across 400 acres and cuts the grass, and 50 Cent turned it into a punchline. But here's the trick. That tractor Rick Ross rides has tinted windows, air conditioning, a sound system, and a radio Rick Ross tuned himself. Rick Ross treats the property like a working farm because Rick Ross grew up watching men treat land like an investment that pays generational rent. The lawn joke is not the flex 50 Cent thinks it is. The lawn joke is Rick Ross literally cutting overhead on property that appreciates faster than most tech stocks. Rick Ross saves money on landscaping and turns it into a photo op. That is not broke behavior. That is boss behavior wearing a farmer costume. And Rick Ross said the quiet part out loud too. Rick Ross said Rick Ross has 25 ventures and partnerships. Rick Ross said Rick Ross flew back from Dubai last week. Rick Ross said Rick Ross was heading to Canada on Friday. Rick Ross said a single strip club performance on a random Monday covers Rick Ross expenses for the entire year. Not the week, the year. Whether you believe every one of those numbers or not, the confidence in the delivery matters. Because in this industry, the story is the currency. And Rick Ross tells a better story about Rick Ross than any critic ever will. Now let us circle to the darkest angle of all. The one nobody wants to say. Rick Ross referenced 50 Cent's mother on a podcast this month. Not in a diss. In a passing shot inside a longer answer. Rick Ross said on record that 50 Cent had a child by a woman Rick Ross described in language that cannot be repeated in a family-friendly script. That line was not a joke. That line was a warning. Because 50 Cent's mother, Sabrina Jackson, was killed in a house fire when 50 Cent was 8 years old. That is public record. That is documented history. And Rick Ross knew exactly what invoking that lineage would do to 50 Cent's mentions. Rick Ross fired a nuclear round dressed like a small aside, and the internet barely noticed the size of the crater. 50 Cent's response. 50 Cent laughed on Instagram Live and said Rick Ross likes a line about the mother part. That was 50 Cent's counterpunch. A shrug and a laugh. But watch 50 Cent's posting cadence in the 72 hours after that podcast. The frequency spiked. The lawn jokes doubled. The airport reposts multiplied. That is not a man unbothered. That is a man reaching for content to bury a wound. Rick Ross had a nerve so specific that 50 Cent had to redirect the entire timeline to cover the sting. That is the pattern nobody is teaching you in the comment section. Look at 50 Cent's Instagram every time Rick Ross drops a podcast. The posting spike is measurable. Screen record it and time it. Every Rick Ross media hit is followed within hours by a 50 Cent volley. Every 50 Cent volley is followed by a wave of memes. Every wave of memes is followed by a hip-hop blog headline. Every hip-hop blog headline is followed by a YouTube commentator, like me pulling the whole thread apart. That cycle keeps 50 Cent in the algorithm without 50 Cent having to release a single note of new music. And that is the actual product. The feud is the product. Rick Ross is the raw material 50 Cent processes into engagement. And here's the part that should make every fan of hip-hop uncomfortable. If the feud is the product, then peace is bad for business. Which means 50 Cent will never accept Rick Ross's Star Island invitation. Never. Not next month. Not next year. Not on a birthday. Not at a funeral. Because peace ends a content pipeline, and 50 Cent's brand needs a pipeline more than 50 Cent needs a win. Meanwhile, Rick Ross keeps doing what Rick Ross has always done. Rick Ross opens more Wingstops. Rick Ross drops verses. Rick Ross hosts a car show at Promised Land every summer. Rick Ross performs in Colombia with Trick Daddy. Rick Ross closes deals in Dubai. Rick Ross rides a tractor. Rick Ross cuts the grass. Rick Ross smiles for the airport photo. And every time Rick Ross does one of those things, 50 Cent has to post about it, because 50 Cent cannot afford to let a Rick Ross news cycle breathe without a 50 Cent stamp on the timeline. So the next time you see a Rick Ross broke rumor, ask a smarter question. Ask who benefits from the rumor. Ask who monetizes the rumor. Ask who converts the rumor into headlines, into podcast bookings, into television appearances, into product launches. The answer is never Rick Ross. The answer is the person who is loudest in the reply section. And that person, every single time, is 50 Cent. That does not mean Rick Ross is immune to real financial pressure. Nobody is. The music industry has changed. Streaming pays pennies where albums once paid platinum. Touring costs have exploded. Insurance premiums for celebrity properties have doubled. Fuel costs for private jets have tripled. Security details cost more than mid-level salaries. Every artist Rick Ross's age is recalculating. Every artist, including 50 Cent, whether 50 Cent admits it or not. So the honest answer is that Rick Ross is probably managing the same math every rich rapper over 40 is managing right now, and doing a better job of hiding the recalculations than most. But hiding a recalculation is not the same thing as going broke. Flying commercial once is not the same thing as being unable to afford a jet. Cutting a lawn is not the same thing as running out of money. Owning a $200,000 watch that some collector questions is not the same thing as owning nothing. These are the distinctions the internet refuses to make. And every distinction the internet refuses to make is a distinction 50 Cent gets to exploit for another day of relevance in the machine. So here's where Rick Ross actually stands based on the receipts Rick Ross has personally dropped in public. 25 active ventures. Multiple Wingstop franchises still printing money. A publishing catalog still earning quarterly. A tour still moving through arenas and international dates. A jet parked in a hangar for a Starlink upgrade. A 400-acre estate purchased below market and appreciating annually while Rick Ross rides a tractor. A car show that draws hundreds of thousands of dollars in sponsorship without breaking a sweat. A club performance schedule that pays for a full calendar year of expenses in a single night, according to Rick Ross's own math. And on the other side of the ledger, one blurry airport photo, one lawn joke, and one Uncle Murder repost. Do that math yourself and tell me who is winning. The final layer nobody will say out loud is this. 50 Cent does not want Rick Ross to lose. 50 Cent needs Rick Ross to keep winning just enough to stay a target. Because a broke Rick Ross is not funny. A broke Rick Ross is a tragedy. And tragedy does not sell memes. A rich Rick Ross cutting a lawn is content. A rich Rick Ross flying commercial for a friend is content. A rich Rick Ross wearing a watch that a collector questions is content. Rick Ross must remain a rich target for the machine to keep printing. And 50 Cent knows it. That is why 50 Cent has never, in 17 years, actually tried to end Rick Ross. 50 Cent has only ever tried to keep Rick Ross busy. Keeping Rick Ross busy is the entire strategy. Ending Rick Ross would end the show. So watch what happens next. Rick Ross will drop another single. Rick Ross will open another restaurant. Rick Ross will host another car show. Rick Ross will board another flight, private or commercial, and post another photo. And within hours, without fail, 50 Cent will react. Because the cycle is the paycheck. The paycheck is the beef. The beef is the empire. And the empire only stands as long as Rick Ross is still on the field for 50 Cent to run drills against every week. Now you know why this rumor storm exists. Now you know why the airport photo mattered. Now you know why the lawn joke will not die. Now you know why Rick Ross will keep offering meetings 50 Cent will never accept. And now you know the one truth the timeline will never admit out loud on any platform. Rick Ross is not the underdog in this story. Rick Ross is the entire reason the story still has a stage. Take Rick Ross out of the equation, and there is no equation left for 50 Cent to solve. Drop a comment, and tell me what you think about all of it. Do you think Rick Ross is actually facing financial pressure? Or is this the biggest coordinated perception attack in modern hip-hop history? Do you think 50 Cent will ever sit down at Star Island? Or will the invitation die in a group chat neither man ever opens again? Tell me who is winning right now. Rick Ross, 50 Cent, or the algorithm that eats Rick Ross and 50 Cent alive every single week without picking a side, like the video. Follow the page. Share this with the one friend in your group chat who still believes every viral photo tells a whole story of a man. Because after tonight, that friend needs a wake-up call from you, and only you. I will see everybody in the next one. Trust the receipts, question every repost, and remember who really owns what and who is a renter.